The house was buzzing with energy, as it always was when the wealthy hosts threw one of their lavish parties. This time, it was a grand evening filled with fine wine, laughter, and chatter. The guests, elegantly dressed, filled the living room, each one exchanging stories and sharing jokes. The chandeliers above glimmered with light, and the sound of classical music played softly in the background. But as the night continued, a different kind of excitement began to build among the guests. In the corner of the room, unnoticed by most, was the maid. She moved about silently, serving drinks and tidying up the spaces where guests had gathered. Her uniform was neat, her expression calm, but her mind was elsewhere. She had worked in this house for years, but rarely did anyone ever take a moment to acknowledge her. She wasn't bothered by it. She was used to being invisible, a quiet figure in the background of these extravagant events. The hostess, however, was not someone who would let anything slip by unnoticed. She had a playful side, and her eyes were always searching for the next bit of mischief. As she mingled with her friends, an idea began to form in her mind. She glanced over at the maid standing by the drinks table, quietly observing the guests. A mischievous grin spread across the hostess's face. "Wouldn't it be fun," she whispered to one of her friends, "to invite her to play the piano? Imagine the look on everyone's faces." Her friend laughed, clearly intrigued by the idea. "That's a brilliant prank. No one's ever seen her do anything besides clean. She'll probably be awkward and make a fool of herself. It'll be hilarious." The hostess's eyes sparkled as she saw the opportunity for a perfect joke. The grand piano in the corner of the room was always a point of pride for her, a symbol of sophistication and class. The idea of having the maid, who never spoke much and stayed out of the way, perform on it seemed both funny and fitting for a party like this. Without another word, the hostess walked over to the maid, who was arranging a tray of glasses on a nearby table. The maid looked up, her face blank but polite, ready to do whatever was asked of her. "Excuse me," the hostess said with a smile. "How would you feel about playing the piano for us tonight?" The maid blinked, a slight surprise crossing her features. She had never been asked to play before. In fact, no one ever seemed to even acknowledge that she might know how to play. Her hands, which were used to dusting and cleaning, were never associated with music. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. "Oh, it's just for fun," the hostess continued, sensing her hesitation. "We thought it would be a nice touch for the evening. Don't worry, it'll be great." The maid's fingers briefly twitched, and she looked toward the piano, its ivory keys gleaming under the soft light. She had played the piano once many years ago before she had taken this job. She had never told anyone that she had learned to play, that she had once studied music as a child. But now, here was an opportunity, albeit one that came with the weight of uncertainty. She was being asked to perform in front of a room full of people, most of whom she had never even spoken to. "Please," the hostess urged, sensing the maid's reluctance. "We'd love to hear you play. It's just a bit of fun." There was no turning back now. The maid stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath, and then nodded. "All right," she said softly. The hostess clapped her hands together in excitement and turned to the crowd. "Everyone, we have a surprise for you," she announced. "Our lovely maid here has agreed to grace us with a piano performance. Let's give her a warm round of applause." The guests, already amused by the idea, gathered around the piano. They weren't expecting much, just a little bit of awkwardness and perhaps a few clumsy notes. The maid, still unsure, walked over to the piano and sat down. Her fingers lightly touched the keys, testing the feel of the smooth surface. The guests laughed amongst themselves, exchanging whispers. It was all in good fun, they thought. The maid's hands hovered over the piano for a moment, as if she was considering what to play. The room was filled with the chatter of guests, most not paying much attention. The hostess stood nearby, grinning, pleased with her little prank. Her friends watched, waiting for the maid to fumble through a piece, perhaps embarrass herself. Then, in an unexpected moment of silence, the maid pressed her fingers down on the keys. A single note rang out, clear and perfect, echoing through the room. It was unlike anything the guests had expected. They had anticipated a mistake, a nervous stutter, but instead the sound was striking, a note that commanded attention. Everyone paused. The maid's fingers glided effortlessly across the piano, and suddenly the room seemed to hold its breath. There was no awkwardness, no fumbling. Instead, there was only music, beautiful and precise, flowing from her hands, as though she had been playing in front of audiences for years. As the maid's hands continued to move across the piano, the room slowly fell into a profound silence. What began as a playful joke had unexpectedly transformed into something much more. The notes she played were not only flawless, but also rich, with emotion. Each note seemed to tell a story, evoking feelings no one had anticipated. The guests, initially chuckling and exchanging glances, now stood frozen in place, unsure of how to react. The hostess, who had orchestrated this entire prank, was among the most shocked of all. Her wide eyes revealed that she had not expected this outcome. She had thought the maid would struggle, that the performance would be awkward and funny in its own right. But now, as the maid's hands danced across the keys, it was clear that this was no joke. This was something genuine, something extraordinary. One of the guests, a well-known pianist himself, stood in the back of the room, his arms folded. His lips were slightly parted as he watched the maid with disbelief. He was no stranger to music. He had studied it for years, performing in concert halls around the world. And yet, what he was witnessing now left him speechless. The maid's technique, her precision, and the emotion that poured from her music were all of the highest caliber. It wasn't just a random tune, it was a piece of art. Another guest, a woman who had spent much of the evening gossiping, was now leaning forward, her eyes locked on the pianist. She had expected to see a nervous performance at best, a few missed notes and awkward pauses. But what she was hearing was nothing like what she had imagined. There was no hesitation in the maid's playing, just a deep, unwavering confidence that commanded the room's full attention. The maid, unaware of the impact she was having on the crowd, continued to play. She had no need for applause or recognition. For her, the music was its own reward. She had been playing for years in the privacy of her own space, always keeping her talent hidden, never wanting to share it with anyone. But tonight something had shifted. Perhaps it was the music itself, or perhaps it was the atmosphere of the room. But she allowed herself to feel the music fully and express herself in a way she never had before. As the final notes of the first piece faded into the air, the room remained still, as though the guests had all forgotten how to move. They weren't sure if they should clap, or if the performance was over, or if they should even acknowledge what had just happened. They had been so certain this would be a joke, so sure the maid would fail, that now they were caught off guard, unsure of how to process the unexpected beauty they had just witnessed. The maid slowly lifted her hands from the keys, but instead of rushing to leave or feeling embarrassed, she sat back and looked around the room. Her eyes scanned the faces of the guests, who were now exchanging stunned glances. For a moment, no one spoke. It was as though the sound of the music still lingered in the air, holding everyone in a quiet spell. One of the guests, a man with a reputation for being particularly sharp-tongued, was the first to break the silence. He cleared his throat, trying to mask the surprise in his voice. That was incredible," he said, his tone now much more respectful than before. The pianist in the back of the room nodded, his arms still folded, his expression unreadable. "You have an extraordinary gift," he added quietly. The maid, who had not expected to be acknowledged in such a way, simply nodded her head. She didn't feel the need to explain herself, to offer a backstory or defend her talent. The music had spoken for her, and in that moment, it was enough. The hostess, her surprise slowly giving way to a feeling of deep embarrassment, took a step forward. She had been the one to suggest this prank, the one to invite the maid to play, and now she realized that her joke had completely backfired. She had wanted to humiliate the maid, to make a laughingstock out of her, but instead she had witnessed something beautiful and rare. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. I didn't know," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "I had no idea you were so talented." The maid, still seated at the piano, didn't respond immediately. She simply gazed at the keys, her fingers brushing lightly over the surface as though she was lost in thought. She had never meant to show anyone what she could do. She had kept her music to herself for so long, afraid of being judged, afraid of being seen as something other than the quiet, unremarkable Maid. But in this moment, with the music still hanging in the air, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of liberation. Another guest, a woman who had been standing near the hostess, took a step forward, her voice filled with admiration. "You should play more often," she said. "That was beautiful." The maid's lips parted, but she said nothing. She wasn't sure how to respond. She had never been told something like that before. She had always been in the background, never noticed, and now, in the midst of this strange turn of events, she was suddenly the center of attention. The guests, who had all gathered around the piano by this point, were now talking amongst themselves. Some were commenting on how impressive the performance had been. Others were debating the technical aspects of the music. But no one, not even the hostess, seemed to understand just how much this moment meant to the maid. To her, this wasn't just about playing the piano. It was about being seen, about being heard in a way she never had before. She had shared a part of herself, a part of her past that had been hidden away for so long, and the response she had received was far from what she had expected. The hostess, still trying to recover from her own shock, spoke up again. We had no idea," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry for making you do this. It was supposed to be a joke, but you've just shown us something amazing." The maid smiled softly, but there was no bitterness in her expression. She simply nodded again, not seeking forgiveness, but rather acknowledging the change that had just taken place. She had been the subject of a prank, but what she had received in return was something far more valuable. The respect of the people around her, a glimpse of what it might feel like to be seen for who she truly was. The pianist, who had been quiet up until now, stepped forward and extended his hand to her. "I'd like to speak with you sometime," he said. "If you ever want to play for a real audience, I can help you." The maid's eyes widened, but she didn't know how to respond. This was not what she had expected, a professional pianist offering to help her. She had never imagined such an opportunity. She looked down at her hands, unsure if she was ready to accept such an offer. It was overwhelming, but it was also a chance to do something she had only ever dreamed of. The silence in the room stretched on for a moment longer before the hostess finally spoke again. "Why don't we all sit down and have a drink?" she suggested, her voice now gentler than before. "I think we all need a moment to digest what just happened." The guest began to move away from the piano, but the maid remained seated, her hands still resting lightly on the keys. She had never expected this, never dreamed that one moment could change everything. And yet, as she sat there listening to the fading echoes of the music she had just played, she realized that something had shifted. She had not only shared her talent with others, but she had also shared a piece of herself. As the evening progressed, the maid remained at the piano, quietly observing the guests. The air in the room had shifted completely. What had started as a light-hearted prank was now something deeper, something none of them had expected. The music she had played lingered in their minds, and as the guests murmured to one another, they couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. The hostess, who had initiated the prank, stood off to the side with her arms crossed, a look of uncertainty on her face. She had never intended for this moment to turn out the way it had. At first, she had been driven by a desire to entertain her guests, to create a memorable experience. But now, as she watched the maid sitting by the piano, she felt a strange sense of guilt wash over her. She had tried to embarrass her, and instead, she had witnessed something far more profound. The pianist, who had been in the room earlier, still in awe of the maid's playing, approached her once more. His expression was one of admiration, but also of curiosity. He had seen countless performers, some of them world-renowned, but he had never experienced anything quite like this. The emotion in the maid's playing had struck him in a way that no other music had for a long time. "Would you like to play something else?" he asked gently, his voice warm but respectful. "You don't have to, of course, but I think you have an incredible gift." The maid looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She had not expected this kind of attention, especially not from someone with such an established reputation in the music world. She had spent her life hiding her talent, not wanting anyone to know, and now she was being offered a chance to play again, this time in front of an audience that had witnessed her brilliance. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. The piano, which had once felt like a private sanctuary for her, now seemed like a stage, one she was not sure she was ready for. But something inside her stirred. Perhaps it was the warmth of the guests' responses, or perhaps it was the sincerity in the pianist's voice, but she felt a tug in her heart. Maybe it was time to share her music after all. I don't know what to play, she said softly, almost to herself. The pianist smiled kindly. It doesn't matter what you play. Just play what feels right. There was something comforting about his words. No pressure, no expectations, just the music free from judgment. For a moment she let herself relax. Her hands returned to the keys and she began to play again. This time it wasn't just for herself. It wasn't just for the guests either. It was for the pure joy of the music. The guests, still gathered around the piano, fell silent once more. The room filled with the sound of the notes, each one flowing naturally, effortlessly. It was as though the maid had found her voice, and with it, she spoke through the music. Her fingers moved fluidly over the keys, playing a beautiful, haunting melody that seemed to echo the emotions she had kept hidden for so long. As she played, the crowd seemed to forget everything else around them. The sound of the piano consumed the room, drawing everyone in. It wasn't just the technical skill that had captivated them. It was the emotion that poured from each note. The music was deep, soulful, as if it had come from a place far beyond the walls of the room. The hostess, who had initially planned to use the maid for her own amusement, now stood at the back of the room watching in awe. She had never known this side of the maid. She had never imagined that the quiet, reserved woman who cleaned her house could possess such a depth of feeling, such a connection to the music. The hostess felt a rush of embarrassment as she thought about how she had tried to make a fool of the maid, never once considering the possibility that she was more than just a housekeeper. As the maid's music filled the room, the guests began to exchange looks of disbelief. Some had their eyes closed, lost in the beauty of the melody. Others simply watched in stunned silence. It was clear that this was no ordinary performance. It was something rare, something powerful. The pianist in the back of the room remained standing, his arms still folded, but now his expression was one of genuine admiration. "Who is she?" one of the guests whispered to another, her voice barely audible over the music. "I have no idea," came the reply, "but I'm glad we got to witness this." The hostess, still feeling a sense of guilt, finally approached the maid. She stood for a moment watching her play before she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice laced with sincerity. "I never meant for this to happen. I thought you would be awkward, and I never imagined that you were capable of something like this." The maid paused for a brief moment, but only to let the last few notes of the melody fade. Then, without missing a beat, she smiled softly and said, "It's all right. I never wanted anyone to know, but sometimes it's hard to keep something inside." The hostess felt a pang of regret. She realized that she had misjudged the maid in every possible way. She had thought her to be little more than a servant, someone who was simply there to do her bidding. But now, seeing the maid's talent, seeing her depth, the hostess understood just how wrong she had been. "You're incredible," the hostess said, her voice trembling with a mixture of awe and guilt. "I'm so sorry." The maid, still smiling, simply nodded. She wasn't looking for apologies, and she wasn't looking for praise. She was just grateful to be seen, to be recognized for something other than her duties. It had taken years for her to come to terms with her own talent, and now, in this moment, she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known before. As the music came to a close, the room erupted in applause. The guests who had been silent throughout the performance were now clapping enthusiastically. The pianist, who had been quietly observing from the back, was the first to stand and offer his praise. His claps were steady and slow at first, but then they grew louder, and soon the entire room was applauding the maid's performance. The maid stood up, her face flushed but calm. She didn't bow or acknowledge the applause in any grand way. She simply stepped away from the piano and nodded her head, her way of thanking the guests for their appreciation. "I think we've all learned something tonight," the pianist said, his voice carrying over the applause. "Sometimes we don't see the full potential in the people around us. We think we know who they are, but there's so much more beneath the surface." The guests, still clapping, nodded in agreement. The maid, who had been so invisible to them just moments before, had now become the center of attention. They all realized, too late, that they had underestimated her. As the applause slowly died down, The hostess approached the maid once again. This time there was no mocking, no playful teasing. There was only respect. "Would you consider performing for us again sometime?" the hostess asked, her tone sincere. "I'd love to hear more of your music." The maid, who had once been afraid to share her talent with anyone, now felt a quiet sense of pride. She had stepped out of the shadows, and in doing so, she had shown everyone who she truly was. "I think I'd like that," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to truly smile. The days following the unexpected piano performance were filled with a mix of emotions for the maid. She had never anticipated the way her life would change in such a short time. The guests who had witnessed her performance had not only shown her respect, but many of them began to reach out to her in different ways. The pianist, who had been particularly moved by her music, had invited her to his studio to discuss the possibility of working together. At first, the maid was unsure. She had always kept her talent hidden, and the idea of stepping into the world of professional music felt overwhelming. But over the next few days, as she reflected on what had happened, she began to see the opportunity in a new light. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding, to stop being invisible. The thought of sharing her music with the world, of allowing herself to be seen for something other than the maid, was both terrifying and thrilling. The hostess, who had initiated the prank that turned into a life-changing event for the maid, also began to act differently. She found herself seeking out the maid more often, not to give orders or ask for help, but simply to talk. She had been so focused on her own world, her own desires for entertainment, that she had never really taken the time to understand the woman who had worked for her all these years. Now she found herself wanting to make amends, to build a connection with the maid that went beyond the typical employer-employee dynamic. One afternoon, the hostess approached the maid while she was folding linens in the hallway. She seemed hesitant, unsure of how to begin the conversation. The maid looked up from her work, noticing the change in her employer's demeanor. It was clear that something had shifted. "Can we talk for a moment?" the hostess asked, her voice softer than usual. The maid paused, setting the linens down carefully. She wasn't sure what to expect. The atmosphere between them had been awkward since the night of the performance, and the maid wasn't sure if the hostess wanted to apologize again or if there was something else on her mind. "Of course," the maid said. Quietly, the hostess led her to a small sitting room where they could speak privately. There was an awkward silence for a moment as the hostess sat down, clearly thinking about what to say next. The maid, standing nearby, waited patiently, not wanting to rush her employer. Finally, the hostess spoke. "I've been thinking about what happened," she began, her voice calm but sincere. "And I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I was wrong to treat you the way I did, to make you a part of that joke. I never realized how much I underestimated you." The maid's eyes softened, but she said nothing. She had already forgiven the hostess in her heart. She understood now that the prank hadn't been meant to harm her. Even if it had, what mattered was that the hostess had recognized her mistake and was willing to make things right. "I don't know how to express how much I regret doing that," the hostess continued, her voice shaky now. "I've spent so much of my life thinking I know everything about the people around me, but I didn't even know you. You've been here all this time, and I never bothered to see who you really are." The maid stood still, listening. There was no bitterness in her, no desire to hold on to the past. She had long since made peace with the fact that people often judged others based on what they saw on the surface. What mattered was that she was finally being seen. "I've been thinking," the hostess said after a pause. "Maybe we can do something more with your music. You deserve to be heard. I know I can't offer you a music career or anything like that, but I'd like to help in any way I can. If you want, I could help you get some lessons, maybe even perform at a few events. I just want to make up for what I did." The maid was surprised by the offer. She had never once considered that her employer might go out of her way to help her in this way. It was a kind gesture, but the maid wasn't sure if she was ready to step into the spotlight just yet. Still, there was something in her that wanted to say yes. "To take a chance on herself, I'll think about it," she said softly, her voice betraying a hint of emotion. The hostess smiled, a genuine smile this time, and nodded. "Take all the time you need," she said. "But if you ever change your mind, just know that I'm here to support you." As the maid left the sitting room, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The conversation had been difficult, but it had also been freeing. She had never imagined that her employer would offer such kindness or that she would have the chance to pursue her music in any way. But now, with the possibility open to her, she felt a sense of hope stirring within her. The next few days brought a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. The pianist who had offered to help her had reached out again, asking if she would be willing to meet with him and discuss her musical goals. He had mentioned the possibility of teaching her more advanced techniques, of helping her refine her skills so that she could perform in front of real audiences. It was an offer that made the maid's heart race, but at the same time it filled her with fear. What if she wasn't good enough? What if the world wasn't ready for her music? But as she sat alone one evening, reflecting on everything that had happened since that night at the piano, she realized something. The fear that had held her back for so long no longer had as much power over her. She had already taken the first step, by playing in front of those guests, by allowing herself to be seen. Now it was time to take another step. The maid took a deep breath, her hands resting on her lap. She thought about the piano, about the music that flowed from her hands so effortlessly. She thought about the guests who had applauded her, about the pianist who believed in her. And most of all, she thought about herself, her own potential, her own dreams. The next morning, she made her decision. She would meet with the pianist. She would allow herself the chance to grow, to explore her music in a way she had never allowed herself before. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to find out. That evening, the maid approached her employer once more. "I've decided," she said softly, her eyes steady but filled with quiet resolve. "I'd like to take the offer. I want to learn more about music to improve my playing." The hostess, who had been waiting for this moment, smiled widely. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "I'll do whatever I can to support you. You deserve this." And so, with the support of her employer and the encouragement of the pianist, the maid embarked on a new journey. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when doubt crept in. But with each practice, with each new lesson, she grew more confident in her abilities. She was no longer just a maid. She was a musician, a person with a gift to share. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, the maid felt that her future was in her own hands. As the weeks passed, the maid's life transformed in ways she had never imagined. The initial nerves that had accompanied her decision to step into the world of music began to fade as she dedicated herself to her lessons. Every evening after finishing her duties around the house, she would sit at the piano and practice. At first, the notes felt foreign to her, the complexities of advanced pieces difficult to grasp. But each day she grew more comfortable, more confident. Music, which had once been a private escape, had now become something she was beginning to share with others. Her lessons with the pianist were always challenging, but in a good way. He pushed her to explore new techniques, to experiment with different styles, and most importantly, to find her own voice in the music. He saw in her not just a talented pianist, but someone with a depth of emotion that could transform her playing. It was as if her music had the power to touch people in a way that few performers could. One afternoon, a few months after she had started her lessons, the pianist invited her to perform at a small recital he was hosting. At first she hesitated. The idea of performing in front of an audience still terrified her. She wasn't sure if she was ready for such a big step. But the pianist reassured her, telling her that the audience would be understanding and that it was a safe space for her to grow as a musician. "I know you're ready," he said one day during their lesson. "The way you've been playing lately, it's different. You've found something new in your music, and I think it's time for you to share it." After some consideration, she agreed. The maid had never thought she would stand on a stage, let alone perform in front of a crowd. But with each practice, with each lesson, she had become more certain that this was the right path for her. The music had become a part of her, and now it was time to share it with the world. On the night of the recital, the maid felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. She arrived at the small venue, a quiet, intimate space with soft lighting and a welcoming atmosphere. The guests were a mixture of music lovers, friends, and colleagues of the pianist. They all seemed so warm, so inviting, but the maid's heart was racing. She wasn't sure if she was ready. What if she made a mistake? What if she wasn't good enough? But as she sat at the piano, the familiar weight of the keys beneath her fingers calmed her nerves. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the sound of her breathing steady her. This was her moment not to be perfect but to be herself, to share the music that had been a part of her for so long. The first few notes were tentative, but as the piece progressed, she found herself sinking deeper into the music. She felt the emotions that had been buried within her for so long flow through her fingertips. Each note seemed to express a part of her story, a piece of her soul. She wasn't just playing the piano anymore. She was telling a story, sharing a part of herself that had remained hidden for so long. The audience, at first quiet and reserved, slowly became absorbed in the music. The maid could feel their attention, but it didn't make her nervous. Instead, it felt like a quiet encouragement, a silent nod of approval. As she played, she began to realize that this wasn't just about her performance. It was about the connection she could create through the music. The room seemed to come alive with each passing moment, as if the music itself was weaving a thread between her and the listeners, binding them all together in a shared experience. When the final notes faded, the room was still for a moment. It was as if time had stopped. Then slowly the applause began. It was quiet at first, hesitant even, but then it grew louder. The maid opened her eyes, surprised to see the smiles on the faces of the guests. She had expected a polite response, maybe a few claps, but the warmth in the applause told her that something more had happened. Her music had connected with them. She had been heard. The pianist, who had been standing at the back of the room, was among the first to approach her. His face was lit with pride. "That was beautiful," he said simply. "I knew you had it in you." The maid smiled, her heart still pounding with the adrenaline of the performance. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel proud. She had done it. She had shared her music with the world, and it had been received with love and appreciation. After the recital, many guests approached her, telling her how much they had enjoyed her performance. Some asked if she had been playing for a long time. Others simply complimented her on her technique and the depth of emotion she had conveyed. The hostess, who had been sitting in the audience, was also there to offer her congratulations. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice full of genuine warmth. "You were amazing up there. I can't believe how far you've come." The maid, overwhelmed by the praise, simply nodded. She felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, a sense that she had finally found a place for herself in the world. She had been seen, not just as a maid, but as a person, as an artist. The pianist approached her once again, this time with a suggestion that made her heart skip a beat. "I have a few contacts in the music industry," he said, his voice low but excited. "If you're interested, I think we could start looking into some opportunities." "You're ready for the next step," the maid blinked in surprise. She had never considered that this recital could lead to anything more. The idea of pursuing a career in music had seemed so far out of reach, something she could only dream of. But now the possibility was within her grasp. She felt a mixture of excitement and fear, but the thought of playing music for a living, of sharing her gift with the world on a larger scale, felt like a dream she was finally allowed to chase. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice trembling with both hope and uncertainty. Over the next few weeks, the maid began to consider the pianist's offer. She realized that she had spent so much of her life hiding her talent, afraid of what others might think or how they might judge her. But the response to her performance had shown her that her music had value. It had touched people, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was ready to take that next step. With the support of her employer and the pianist, the maid began to explore the possibility of performing professionally. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when she questioned whether she was truly ready for the challenges that lay ahead. But she knew that she couldn't let fear hold her back any longer. Music had always been a part of her, and now it was time to share it with the world. A few months later, the maid found herself standing on a stage once again, this time in a larger venue surrounded by an eager crowd. She had taken the leap, and her life was no longer the same. The journey that had started with a simple piano performance at a party had led her to this moment. She was no longer just the maid. She was a musician, a woman with a gift, a story to tell, and a future full of possibilities. As she played the first note of the piece, she felt a surge of confidence. She was no longer afraid. This was her time. The music flowed from her fingers, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. The following months were a whirlwind for the maid. What had started as an unexpected, almost accidental performance had grown into something far more profound. The piano had once been a mere instrument for her own quiet enjoyment, but now it had become a symbol of her transformation, a bridge to a new life. As she continued to work with the pianist, refining her technique and broadening her repertoire, her confidence grew. She had always been humble, never one to boast or seek attention, but now she was ready to embrace the future that had once seemed so distant and impossible. Her performances began to draw larger crowds. The small recitals she had once feared were replaced by performances in concert halls, where the audience was eager to hear her play. The maid, who had once been invisible to most, was now the center of attention, not for her past, but for her talent and the passion she brought to her music. She felt alive on stage, her heart beating in rhythm with each note she played. Music, which had once been an intimate and private part of her, was now something she could share with the world. Despite her growing success, she remained grounded. She never forgot the quiet, humble beginnings that had led her to this point. She continued to live in the same modest house, keeping in touch with her former employer and the pianist who had opened so many doors for her. The pianist remained her mentor, guiding her through each step of her musical journey. He never pushed her too hard, always encouraging her to take her time and find her own way. He had faith in her from the very beginning, and his belief in her never wavered. One evening, after a particularly moving performance, the maid sat in the quiet backstage area, reflecting on how far she had come. The applause from the audience still echoed in her ears, but she was alone with her thoughts now, a rare moment of solitude amidst the whirlwind of her new life. The pianist joined her after a few minutes, his face lit with pride. "You did it again," he said with a smile. "You played with so much emotion tonight." The audience could feel it. The maid nodded, a soft smile playing at her lips. "It's still surreal," she admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if this is all just a dream." "It's not a dream," he replied gently. "You've earned every bit of it. All the hours you've spent practicing, all the performances. This is your reality now." She looked down at her hands. The same hands that had once been used to scrub floors and wash dishes. Now the hands of a musician. It still amazed her that she was living this new life, a life she had never thought possible. She had always been so focused on getting by, on fulfilling her duties, that she had never allowed herself to dream of something more. But now, with each performance, with each new opportunity, she began to understand that anything was possible. Over time, her music began to gain recognition beyond the small circles she had once known. Critics praised her performances, writing about the raw emotion and technical skill she brought to the piano. She was invited to play at prestigious venues, and her name began to appear in the arts sections of newspapers and magazines. Still, the maid remained humble, never allowing the attention to go to her head. She knew that her journey had been long and filled with obstacles, but she also knew that she had earned everything she had achieved. Her former employer, who had once tried to make a joke of her, was now one of her biggest supporters. She attended every one of the maid's performances, sitting in the front row, always eager to hear the music that had once been hidden away. The hostess, who had felt guilty for underestimating the maid, had become a true friend, someone who was proud to be in the audience when the maid played. One day, the hostess invited the maid to a small gathering at her home. It was a casual event with a few close friends and family, but the maid was touched by the invitation. She had come a long way since the days when she was just another face in the background, serving drinks and cleaning up after parties. Now she was seen as an artist, someone with a unique voice, and she was beginning to believe it herself. As the maid arrived at the hostess's home, she was greeted warmly by everyone. The hostess introduced her to some of her friends, who were eager to talk about the maid's music. It was clear that the once quiet maid was now a person to be admired, a success story that inspired everyone who heard her play. But even in this new world, the maid remained grounded. She didn't need the accolades or the praise. All she needed was the music. The hostess, who had been watching her with a proud smile, approached her quietly after a while. "I'm so happy for you," she said softly. "You've done what so many people only dream of. You found your true calling." The maid smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without your support," she said, her voice sincere. "You were the first person to see something in me." The hostess shook her head. "No, you did all the hard work. You've always had it in you. I'm just glad I was able to help you realize it." It was a simple conversation, but for the maid it meant everything. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, feeling like she was just there to serve others. But now she was a person in her own right, someone whose talents and dreams mattered. She had been seen, truly seen, and that had made all the difference. As the evening wore on, the maid found herself surrounded by people who admired her, not just for her music, but for her story. They were fascinated by how she had gone from being a maid to becoming a celebrated pianist, and they wanted to know everything about her journey. She shared her experiences, speaking openly about the challenges she had faced and the lessons she had learned. And as she spoke, she realized something. She was no longer ashamed of her past. It had shaped her, yes, but it didn't define her. The person she was now, the musician who played from the heart, was the person she had always been meant to be. Later that evening, as she prepared to leave, the hostess came up to her again. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You've accomplished something incredible." The maid smiled, her eyes sparkling. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without all of the people who believed in me. But most of all, I've learned to believe in myself." As she walked out of the hostess's home that night, the maid felt a sense of peace that she had never known before. She had come so far from where she had started, from the quiet, invisible woman who had cleaned and served at parties. Now she was a woman with a future, with a purpose, and with a passion that drove her forward. She had found her voice, and with it, she had found herself. The next morning, she woke up early as she always did, but this time, she didn't feel the weight of obligation or duty. She felt a sense of excitement as she thought about the future, about the opportunities that lay ahead. She had no idea where her music would take her, but she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. She had stepped into the light and there was no turning back now.